Okay, welcome everybody. Oh, that we're good. All right, welcome everybody. So this is going to be our first lecture, and we're actually not going to cover any sort of medical ethics stuff. Instead, what I want to do is I want to focus on ethics as a very general study, right? So I mean, there are ethical theorists who are medical ethicists, and any medical ethicist is going to have a background in ethical theory in general. So, although we don't have the time to go over all of this stuff super thoroughly, I want to have sort of like one lecture where I cover some of the basics so we're all on the same page with some very, very important stuff. Okay, so let's talk about ethics, right? Um, Ethics is an interesting study, and it's something that the vast majority of people haven't studied before, right? Unless really pretty much unless you've studied philosophy or unless you or in some sort of major which has some sort of like ethical requirement. Like sometimes you'll take business ethics or something like that, right? So it's important that we get a couple things clear, right? Just because it's unique and most people haven't studied it. First thing here, right? Ethics is what's known as a normative study. Right. Also, you guys are going to have to excuse my dog shit handwriting. I'm afraid that just comes with this. Um, Normative studies are different than the studies which most of you guys would be used to, right? So most of the time we study things like, science, let's say physics. And physics is the study of, right? Let's do this. How things move. That's like an old-timey definition of physics, but we'll go with it. Oh man, that is completely ineligible. Let's see this. So physics is the study of uh, uh, we'll just say this. How the world is. We'll give a broader definition. Now, take a standard ethical statement, right? Or a standard moral statement. These are synonymous, right? And you'll see that it's different, right? So, like, what's a ethical statement you may make to somebody, right? You may say like, Sally, stop hitting Ben, right? Or Sally, you should stop hitting Ben, right? Notice that that statement, Sally, you should stop hitting Ben, is fundamentally different than what we study in physics. And the reason why it's different is that physics studies how what is the case, right? Or how things are. When ethics studies, all right, let's go back here, how things should be, or how things ought to be, right? It's a fancier term, but that just means should. Right, that's fundamentally different than what we study in other fields, in the vast majority of other fields. Now, there are other normative fields, right? So an example would be actually what's my primary specialty, right, which is epistemology. And epistemology is the study of essentially how you should form beliefs based upon the evidence that you have, right? Or what counts as knowledge. Um, so, an epistemologist may say, oh, well, you should believe this, right? That's not an ethical statement necessarily, but it is still a normative statement, right? So ethics is a specific class, right? It's a specific type of normative study. Um, and one thing that's really important to note about normative studies, right, is that you can't really study normativity, right, by taking a look at how the world is, right? Um, and this means that, so this is how I'll say, how things are, this is how I'll put it, how things are does not entail, right, or does not imply how things should be. there's a term for this. It's called principle. It's called you can't derive an ought from an is, right? Or the is ought principle, right? Essentially, you can't take a look at how things are or what is the case and then derive how things ought to be the case. Now, this is like really interesting though, because generally in science or other studies, right? History, whatever, we take a look at the world. And from that, whether it's from our experiments or whether it's from, some sort of historical record or something like this, we go ahead and we infer, oh, this is true, right? But ethics just works fundamentally different, right? You can't take a look at what is the case and infer anything about what ought to be the case, right? Or you almost always can't. Sometimes that's contentious, but I don't think it should be. In general, I think this is true. Okay. Another thing which is important to note about ethics, right? And this is actually something it shares in common with scientific fields, is that ethics is, or at least we generally take ethics to be, an objective study. Some people will get mad at me for this, right? But at least at this level, we're just going to kind of take this as a fact, right? And this is how most people treat ethics, right? What I mean by this is I mean any sort of ethical statement, right? So Sally should stop hitting Ben, right? Is either true or false. We generally take this to be true, right? Although not everybody realizes that we take this to be true about ethical principles or ethical statements, right? Um, Now, people may go ahead and they may raise their hand, right? If we were in class, and they would say, well, there are plenty of different opinions about ethics. People have different beliefs about ethics, which contradict each other, right? Maybe some people think that Sally should hit Ben, right? I don't know. Maybe let's say Ben's a terrorist, right? Or some sort of criminal. And she doesn't pose any sort of direct threat to Sally, but people may be like, hey, it's okay to hit terrorists. And other people may say, no, it's not okay to hit even terrorists, right? Because we should leave that up to the courts, right, to decide what the punishments are, or something like this, right? There could be disagreement about this fact. Now, it's important to note just because people disagree on something doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of objective truth in the matter, right? Truth has nothing to do with what people believe. So, for example, people also disagree on scientific beliefs all the time, right? So you have a rising community of flat earthers, people who believe that the earth is actually flat, it's not round, right? And then the vast majority of the world believe what I'm pretty sure is the correct view, which is that the earth is round, the earth is spherical. Now, people can disagree on these, right? But it doesn't mean that they're both true, right? Presumably, the earth is either not round or round, right? I was going to say either round or flat, but technically it could be another shape, like donut shape or whatever, right? But I'll say this. If one of those is true, if the earth is flat, then it can't be round. And if the earth is round, then it can't be flat, right? People disagree on these, but we're going to presume that there is truth here, right? And we're going to try and find the truth in ethical statements, right? Or in ethical topics, the same way we would in science or in math or in pretty much whatever study you can imagine, right? Maybe besides like poetry or something like that. Although maybe some poets think that there's objective truth. It's an interesting question, but outside the realm of this class, right? Now, people may also say, like, but people's opinions change over time, right? Society's opinions change over time. So go to 1860 in the United States or in parts of the United States, slavery was legal. People believed that in those parts, people believed en masse that slavery was ethically permissible. In fact, a lot of people believed that slavery should continue to exist, right? That actually that's like what God intended or something like that. And now go to the same parts of the country, and in general, people don't believe that. They believe that slavery is actually impermissible, right? Or it's not okay. It's important to note, right, that we will generally say, right, as an ethicist, Now, this doesn't go for all ethicists, but this is just in general, right? Most ethicists will go ahead and say something like this. Slavery has always been wrong, but people believed that it was okay in 1860, and people believe that it is wrong in 2026. So there are different views, right? But the truth, right, remained the same. Now, this may seem like very radical to people and controversial, but I really don't think it is. If you actually take a look at how we um, talk about ethics on a day-to-day basis, right? If ethics was just like a matter of opinion, then there really wouldn't be a reason to argue with someone else, right? So, say you're pro-choice and you're talking to someone who's pro-life, right? And you're talking about what policy should be passed or whatever, right? Whether or not there should be an abortion ban based upon whatever factor you can imagine. Um, when you're pro-choice and you're talking to this pro-life person, you're not just saying, like, this is my view, right? You're trying to convince the person of something, right? And it would be weird to be trying to convince the person of something if it was like just a matter of their opinion. If they actually decided, or if society as a whole decided what's right and wrong, it'd be weird to try and convince someone of something. When you're arguing with somebody about something, right? In general, you are trying to convince them of something. And if you're trying to convince them of something, you're trying to convince them that something is the case. And if something is the case, that's kind of just what it means for something to be true, if that makes sense. Uh, Generally, if we're in like an actual classroom, what I'll say, like, okay, raise your hand if you believe that there is something worth protesting, right? Some change that you should protest for. And most people raise their hand in the class, right? Some people are kind of just, I don't know, they don't have too many political thoughts or whatever, right? But most people raise their hands, whether or not they protest or not, doesn't really matter, right? And I kind of say, okay, well, if this is just a matter of opinion, like, why are we changing it, right? We're talking about how to make a more just society, right? Why are you pushing for change? If what is just or what is right is just what people agree on, what people think, right? Why would you think that you pushing for change, right, was making society more just? Now, look, this can be doubted, right? Plenty of ethicists, the vast majority no, but plenty of ethicists believe that ethics may not actually be 100% objective, right? Although it may not be 100% subjective, right? Maybe it depends on certain factors or something like that. Maybe it's contextual, right? But at least for this class, I want to come in with the assumption that ethics is an objective study. Now, just because something's an objective study doesn't mean that or something's objectively true or something's objectively false, doesn't mean that we shouldn't tolerate different opinions, right? So take religion as an example. Obviously, there are ethical statements and beliefs that come with religions, but let's just take like creation accounts, right? So Islam is going to have a different creation account than Christianity, right? Take a kind of like a literalist of the Quran, right, and a literalist of the Bible, someone who believes that the creation stories told in them are like true rather than like poetic or something like that. These stories are going to contradict each other. They are, right? This doesn't mean that we can't say it turns out that Islam is correct, right? Doesn't mean that we can't accept Christians in society or whatever, right? It just means that one of them is false, right? Doesn't necessarily say anything about how you should treat someone who believes in a false thing or something like that. Now, it's really important to note, though, right, is generally we try and tolerate different ethical beliefs to some extent, right? Like we don't want to tolerate all ethical beliefs, like we don't want to be Nazis or something, right? We try and tolerate ethical beliefs more than we would tolerate like alternative opinions in science, right? So look, if I was like a science teacher and someone wrote on their essay like the earth is flat, right? I fail them, right? Or give them a bad grade or whatever, right? And the reason why I tolerate that the less than say if somebody writes a different ethical view than I is because I'm less sure when it comes to ethics. Ethics is much harder to figure out, right? Because you can't look at the world and see what's right and wrong, right? you kind of have to infer it from a variety of different ways. And we'll talk a little bit about how ethicists approach that in just a bit. Okay. Okay. So a few things about ethics. Um, Here are a few ethical terms that everyone should be familiar with. And I mean, these are to some extent just English terms, right? So you should kind of be able to infer what they mean. But the first term here would be like permitted or permissible. Oh, my stylus isn't working. Give me 1 second. So let's take this. So ugh, here we go. Permissible. Okay. Um, what permissible means is that it is okay, right? Or someone can do something without breaking whatever, like, without breaking ethical rules, right? There are plenty of things that are ethically permissible. Okay. For example, um, me deciding to lecture standing up is completely permissible, right? Doesn't seem to be breaking any sort of ethical rules. Doesn't seem to be in the domain of ethics at all, right? Whether I should teach standing up or sitting down. I mean, especially if I'm teaching from home, right? Um, Now it's permissible for me to stand up while teaching. It's also permissible for me to stand down while teaching, right? So multiple things can be permissible, right? Um, Ethicists also focus on what is required. It was starting off fine. Here we go. That's better. We're just going to go with it. All right. We'll get this worked out. It's actually the first time I've taught online here. What is required or what is obligated by someone, right? And this just means that uh, we could say it is not okay to not, or that's a complicated way of saying it, right? So we'll say you must, right? You must do this. You must do that. Now we're also going to put like nots in here, right? So if something is not permissible, it's not okay to do it. If you're not required to do something, right? Then it's not the case that you must do it, right? If you're required to not do something, then it's the case that you must not do it, stuff like that. Generally, terms like should and ought, right? They'll say something about what's required for you to do. There are also like other notions which are important in ethics, right? So like one very important notion, right, would be what some people call super obligatory. I'm not going to write that down. It's just going to be a disaster, right? Um, what that means is that it's better if you do it, but you're not necessarily required to do it, right? You can also think of like the opposite of super obligatory, where it's like, you probably shouldn't, but you can, right? But the main things that ethicists talk about, right, is what's permissible and what's required, right? So, like, an example of something that's super obligatory would be like, I don't know, buying your mother flowers on not Valentine's Day, geez. Don't do that. Buying your mother flowers on Mother's Day, right? Uh, it's a nice thing to do, right? It may make you a better son or daughter or child or whatever, you know. But like, I don't know. I'm not going to say that you like ethically ought to, you know. Um, that would be strange. Or maybe helping your friend move, something like that. Okay. So this is what ethicists kind of study as a whole. A few important notes here. Now, there are a couple different like broad areas of ethics, right, that we can think about. And the area which I'm talking about in this lecture, right, I'll call normative ethics, or I'll just say general. I actually don't like the term normative ethics. All ethics is normative. Um, right. And this is essentially the study of what makes things ethical or unethical, right? Or what makes things, what determines. Okay, I'm going to pause this and then get my stylus working. All right, 1 second here. Okay, I'm back here. Sorry about that. Also realized I misspelled general. So, normative or general ethics, right? Okay, I may have spoken too soon. Right. This is the study of what makes something right or wrong. Right. I'm going to explain exactly what this means in a little bit. But then there's also what we're primarily going to be doing in this class, which is applied ethics. Right. And applied ethics is what you should do in specific situations. Right. There's also technically what we call like meta ethics. And this is sort of like right. These are more like metaphysical questions about ethics, right? We're not going to really get into this, but like an example of like a meta-ethical question would be like you know, is are there objective ethical statements, right? We don't want to get into that. Now, it's important to note that like each one of these fields of ethics depends on each other, right? So your meta-ethical view, right, will have something to say about your view in normative ethics, right? And your normative ethics, ethical view, will have stuff to say about your views in applied ethics, right? But it's really hard to kind of start from the ground up, right? It's really hard to start off like, okay, we're going to start doing metaphysics of ethics, and then we're going to go into normative ethics, and then we're going to go ahead and take a look at what you should do in applied situations because of this, right? Like some people try and do that, but that's just a lot of work, right? And you're probably going to make a mistake along the way, or you're going to get confused along the way, or you're just not going to be able to come up with an opinion on the way, right? So we do something kind of interesting, which is even though applied ethics depends on normative ethics and normative ethics depends on meta ethics, right? We're going to some extent, try and do them individually. Now, that doesn't mean it's never going to come up. We will sometimes have normative ethics or general ethics stuff that come up in this class, right? But we're going to try to do applied ethics without doing general ethics, right? Okay, what do I mean when I say the general ethicist, right? Uh, focuses on what makes something right or wrong. Let's use this example, right, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of before, right? It's called the trolley problem. So let's draw, it's supposed to be a train, right? It's on some tracks. Right. And then at the end of the track, right, there are five people. And they're tied down, right? They can't move at all. And the train's moving, right? Choo choo, right? The train is going to get them. But you notice that there's an alternative set of tracks. On the alternative set of tracks, there is just one person. Okay. And you're an onlooker here. You're just passing by, then you see this like terrible scene, and you see this lever, right? And you know, because you like just love trains, right? You're just like a train person. You know the exact model of the train, and you know that if you hit that lever, right, then the train is going to divert its course going forward, and then it's going to instead go on the other track, right? So you essentially have this question, which is it okay for you to hit the lever in order to save four lives, right? Because essentially what we're saying is, okay, well, instead of killing the five people, I'm just going to have the train kill one person. But you're making some sort of decision here. This would generally be like much better in a classroom, where this is generally much better in a classroom because I get people to raise their hands and stuff like this. But I'm just going to tell you guys what most people's intuitions are about this case. Almost everyone, when I come to this case, it says yes, it is okay. Not just it is okay to switch it. Some people say you should switch it, right? You may be bad if you didn't hit the lever, right? Why would you let one person die, right? Or why would you let five people die when only one person could die? And like, the reasoning behind this, the kind of like ethical principle, right? Is pretty like self-explanatory. It's going to be something like more deaths is worse than less deaths, right? Or more bad things is worse than less bad things, right? And we don't like bad things, right? We're ethicists. So we should prioritize the option which will have less bad things happen, right? Take an alternative case here, right? Um, right, so let's write this principle down, right? So we'll say less bad. Yeah, right. Less bad is better than more bad. Seems pretty reasonable. Honestly, it seems like it may just be like trivially true, right? Or I think the specific ethical principle would be is while making a decision, you should make the decision which will result in the better outcome. Something like that. Let's take an alternative case though, right? It's similar to the trolley problem case, but it's different. So let's say there's a doctor, right? He's we're getting into medical ethics already, I guess. Um, let's see, he has his mask on. Yeah, he's a surgeon, we'll say. His little hat. Imagine that's correct, right? He has his coat. I'm going to spend an inappropriate amount of time trying to get this right. Give me a second. All right. All right. All right. That's the best we'll do, right? He's a doctor. Um, and this doctor has this patient come in, right? Now, this patient, he has a broken leg. right? That's his leg being all jagged and stuff, you know. He's on the hospital bed, you know. Now, this patient could be helped like really easily. He just needs to like, I don't know, do some sort of minor surgery on the leg, staple it together, something like that, you know. But he realizes that this patient has five good organs, right? So, and you know, let's say it's, you know, his heart, his kidneys, you know, his lungs, whatever. Doesn't matter. Then let's say that right in the other room, right, there is five patients. I'm not going to draw them out. It took me too long to draw the bed, right? And one of them needs a heart, you know, one of them needs a liver, you know, they need some of them need kidneys or, you know, whatever type of organs, right? But the doctor realizes that he could, you know, take this patient who's besides his leg, otherwise perfectly healthy, right? Put him to sleep, suffocate him. You know, it doesn't have to be brutal, right? It could be very peaceful. Peacefully put this guy to sleep, kill him, and then dissect him, and then put the heart in the patient, which needs a heart, and you know, the liver in the patient that needs the liver, and so on and so forth. And by doing this, right, he could go ahead and save four lives, right? He would essentially be deciding to kill one person instead of letting five people die, right? The five people are going to die, but he can save them by killing one person. Notice that this case is kind of similar to the trolley problem case, right? I mean, you could go ahead and essentially, if you do nothing, five people are going to die, but you can act and instead make it so that only one person is going to die. And I'll ask students, like, okay, what should this doctor do in this case, right? Should he kill the patient? And some people will say yes, right? I'm going to give you guys a spoiler warning when it comes to medical ethics. The answer is no. The doctor should not kill the patient, right? But if we use the moral principle from above, right, that the ethical person, the ethical agent, like we like to say, the ethical actor, right, should do the action which results in the better outcome. All right, if we take that principle, then we would have to go ahead and say that the doctor should kill this guy. And that seems problematic. So, like, why shouldn't the doctor kill the guy, right? And most people are going to say something like this, right? The doctor has a duty specifically, right? To not kill people, to treat their patients, or to do no harm, right? This is the Hippocratic Oath, right? Which is a very important oath in medical history, right? Doctor has this duty to do no harm. And what you end up seeing, right? And that seems plausible, right? Doctors have a responsibility to not kill otherwise perfectly healthy patients. Um, Now, notice, right, that there can be cases, right, where one of these principles conflicts with the other principle, right? This is what's called an ethical dilemma, right? A case where you have one, in general, good ethical reason to act in one way, and another, in general, good ethical reason to act another way. And those two ways are mutually exclusive. You can't do both, right? Now, if we say both of these are important, both the duties which you have and this principle to essentially make it so that, you know, the better outcome is what happens, right? Then we would be in this sort of ethical dilemma and we wouldn't be able to decide what action to do, right? Like maybe a more plausible day-to-day example is, you know, generally we say that you should be nice to your friends, right? Don't be mean to your friends. And generally we say that you should tell the truth to your friends. But there are some times when like those two things conflict, right? Your friend comes to you with this essay that she wrote and she goes, "Hey, I wrote this essay." And you're thinking, you look over it and you're like, "Oh my gosh, this essay is terrible." And she asks you, "Well, how is the essay? Is it good?" Right? You could be honest with her, right? Which is what you generally should do with your friends and say, "This essay is terrible," but that would hurt her feelings. Or you could be nice to her and then she's going to, let's say, turn the essay in, is going to result in a bad grade or something like this, right? This is an ethical dilemma, right? You have reasons, genuine reasons to do contradictory things. So what does the normative ethicist do? Well, the normative or the general ethicist, they essentially want to say, okay, it's really hard to compare these reasons, right? Like comparing duty versus what's going to result in the best consequences, right? That's kind of like comparing like apples and oranges. You can't really weigh them together. So in general, what the general ethicist is going to try and do is they're going to try and come up with some sort of explanation about what factors ultimately make something right or wrong. All right, let's go into a few of these examples, right? So the first one, right, there are three broad types of normative ethicists. Now, there are like specific theories amongst these types, right? But there are people who believe in what's called consequentialism. And this is the view that morality is determined, right? Morality or the moral option is uh, based or dependent on the consequences of the action. Right? Now notice like we go up to the trolley problem. Our reasoning here for this first case seemed to be consequentialist. We're essentially saying five is worse than one, or one death is better than five, right? In this case, right? So we seem to just be thinking, okay, what are the consequences of this action going to be? Now, different types of consequentialists, they'll prioritize different things, right? They'll take a look at, uh, uh, different types of consequences. So, like the most common consequentialist is the utilitarian, and in general, what the utilitarian says is that you should do the action which results in the most amount of pleasure minus pain, right? Or essentially just you should do the action which is going to make people the happiest they possibly could be. You don't necessarily need to focus on pleasure or pain. You can be a consequentialist with really sort of any factor at all, right? And now the consequentialist is going to have a hard time, right, explaining like the doctor case, right? If we're just thinking about consequentialism, very basically, right, it seems to get the first case, the trolley case, good, right? It seems to accurately predict what our intuitions are. It seems to accurately explain what our intuitions are. But it doesn't seem to accurately explain our intuitions about the organ donor case, right? Um, so what would the consequentialist do? Well, the consequentialist would need to play some sort of clever trick or something, and she would need to say something like, well, the world would be worse off if doctors were making these decisions, right? Maybe in this like one-off case, we'd imagine it'd be happier, but if doctors were making these decisions, nobody would actually go into the hospital, and then people would just be dying because they wouldn't get help or whatever. Right. But they need to kind of find a workaround, right? It's not obvious that that's true. Now, there's also another kind of broad theory in ethics, right? Is called deontology. And deontology is essentially a theory of ethics or a type of theory of ethics, which uh, says that what is right is based on, right, or is dependent on uh, what people's duties are, or what their obligations are, right? Um, Now, like one of the most classic examples of a deontologist would be this philosopher Immanuel Kant, right? And he had this like one rule which he called the categorical imperative. Um, and it was essentially something, it was what was it? It was never treat somebody as a mere means to an end, but as an end in themselves, right? He also had a couple other formulations of it, right? But essentially what he believes is like, oh, we have this one rule, do this, right? And deontologists will say, no, what's right and what's wrong is dependent on a variety of different rules. Now, with the deontologist, he seems to get this second case right. Oh my gosh, we said that the doctor has a duty to, do no harm or whatever. Um, but they seem to have a harder time with this first case, right? With the trolley problem case. So, like the consequentialist with the second case, the deontologist in the first case has to essentially come up with some sort of clever explanation. They'll say something like, well, no, in cases where you don't have a duty to do otherwise, you actually have a duty to, like protect as many lives as you can, something like that, you know? And then suddenly they can get the same result. Okay. There's one other broad type of theory. Um, I think it's less popular, and I think for good reason. It's less popular for good reason than consequentialism or deontology, right? But this is called virtue ethics. Okay. And the virtue ethicist, she says that what the ethical decision is based upon is actually based upon how it would impact somebody's moral character. Or somebody's moral character while they're acting, right? Why were they acting that way, right? We'll just put character down, right? Because those are two different things, but they would both be virtue ethical approaches, right? The fundamental moral unit, we could say, according to the virtue ethics ethicist, is character. All right, we're gonna have to just leave it be. Um, what would an argument, right? What do I mean by moral character? Okay, so take this case, right? Let's go to a doctor, right? I won't draw a doctor. We already have one up on the board, right? This guy here, right? Now let's say, just ignore the case he's in, that you have two different doctors. The first doctor, he is an amazing surgeon, right? And but he doesn't really care about the well-being of patients. He's just like really interested in the human body, he's almost like as a machine, right? And he just takes his job as a way to like explore the human body, but he does all of his goals, right? He does all any sort of job that he has or which is put on him, he does it correct. Now let's say that we have this other doctor and she's just as amazing of a surgeon, but she actually really cares about her patients, right? She isn't just a surgeon because she finds the human body fascinating. She's a surgeon because she wants to help people. What's the difference between these two cases? Well, the difference between these cases is that it seems like the second doctor has a better moral character than the first doctor, right? So character is sometimes something that comes up in ethical discussions, right? What was your character? Why did somebody act that way, or something like this? Um, and essentially, the virtue ethicist is going to say, like, no, the fundamental moral unit is not some set of rules. It's not what the consequences of your decision is going to be. It's how it impacts your character or your character when you decided to act that way. Oftentimes, virtue ethicists will have like a set of virtues, right? So one of them may be like courage and humility and stuff like this. And they say that like what you should do is going to be like the mean of all of those sometimes. They may say like especially like Aristotle, he's kind of like the primary virtue ethicist. He essentially said that acting in certain ways makes it easier to act that way in the future, right? So if you are trying to act, you know, as a good person, right, it is going to become easier to act as a good person in the future. And essentially, when you're making these decisions, you should consider the different virtues and stuff like this. I okay. Here's the thing with virtue ethics, right? I'm sure I'm not doing it justice, right? This is like such a broad overview. It's kind of harder to define than deontology or consequentialism, but it is much looser, much more wishy-washy, right? So actually, in the opening to the Nicomachean Ethics, which is Aristotle's primary ethics book, he kind of talks about how ethics isn't like a perfect science, how there are gray cases and stuff like this. Um, and the virtue ethicist, right, to give them some credit, right, the ethicist is better at explaining why sometimes uh, ethics may seem kind of fuzzy, right? Um, okay. Okay, last thing here, right? Notice that when we're talking about consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics, right? What we do is we think about specific cases, whether it's the trolley problem case, or whether it's this doctor case, we think about specific cases, and then we say, can this ethical theory explain our intuitions, explain our gut feeling about what people should or shouldn't do in these cases, right? That's really interesting, right? To some extent, right, the way that we determine what is what ethical theories we should adopt and what we shouldn't adopt, right, seems to be based off of our intuitions. Damn it, man, this is giving me such a hard time today. I'm gonna run to the store and buy a new stylus after this lecture. Don't worry. Here you go. That's better. Right. And essentially what we'll do, right, this is definitely too simplistic, but when we're trying to come up with what sort of general ethical theory we should follow, we'll think about a whole bunch of different cases, and then we'll try and say, okay, what theory explains our intuitions the best, right? And then you'll prioritize some theories over others, right? Or sort some intuitions over others. So you'd say like, okay, well, like my intuition that you shouldn't murder people, right? That's going to be like the most important intuition. And maybe there's this other intuition like you shouldn't steal, right? Maybe I'm fine making this kind of like exception, right, in some cases in order to explain the bigger intuition. This is what the general ethicist does. And a lot of this is going to be background for what we study. But as I was saying earlier, it's really hard to do medical ethics or just applied ethics in general, right, by focusing on this, right? If we had to uh, go over this debate, right, this debate which has been happening for, a few thousand years now, right, before we went into medical ethics, and I hate to say it, but like doctors just wouldn't have guidelines. So instead, what we do, right, is we come up with some set of principles or values or something like that, which we would like the doctor to uphold, which, the consequentialist, the deontologist, and the virtue ethicist, they would all agree on, right? So, for example, let's say autonomy, right? This is an important principle in medical ethics. Essentially, we should just give patients the ability to choose their own care to some extent, right? And that's a tricky issue, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. Now, you can go ahead and explain, right, why autonomy matters as a virtue ethicist or as a deontologist or as a consequentialist, right? So the virtue ethicist would say, like, no, it shows good character, right, if you are essentially allowing other people to make their own decisions or something like this, right? Treating other people kindly. As the deontologist, we can just say, no, there's a rule. Treat other people like they have agency, right? That's a rule. And the consequentialist, it may become a little harder sometimes for them to explain autonomy, but you could go ahead and say something like, The world would be a better place if people left other people to their own devices, right? It's going to have better consequences. Um, so to some extent, right, and this is just to some extent, this debate, right, although it technically would have an impact on what we should do, right, can be separated from discussions about medical ethics in general. Not always, right? And this is going to come up, right? You'll see that virtue ethicists may have different approaches to abortion than deontologists do, right? And we'll get into some of that. But we can do our best to sidestep a lot of the issues of general ethics, right? Although there's certainly going to come up at times. Okay, let me zoom out, show everything here. You can screenshot this if you want. I feel like I wrote a lot more. Must have just been the difficulty of writing it. All right, that's our first lecture. There'll be other lectures posted tomorrow. We all have a good day and stuff.